Hey guys, this is Monica, and you're listening to State of the Pod. Today, we're going to be talking about climate change and its impact on the insects that spread diseases. Now, since there are so many types of insects and other arthropod vectors to cover, this episode is going to focus specifically on mosquitoes. While not every species of mosquito can act as a disease vector, there are several species that can. The ones that can transmit malaria, Zika, West Nile, dengue, which all have huge impacts where they're endemic. Now, generally, we associate diseases like Zika and malaria with tropical regions of the world. But as the Earth's climate changes and the distribution of vectors, pathogens, and the problems associated with the two being in contact, we'll move into regions of the world that were once too cold to be affected by this problem. The most basic effect of global warming on mosquitoes is its impact on their rate of development. Mosquitoes are cold-blooded, which means they can't regulate their own body temperature, and an insect's body temperature is a huge determining factor of their rate of growth and development. Basically, an increase in temperature of the environment that a mosquito is in causes mosquitoes to develop faster, which decreases the time between each generation, causing a significant increase in population sizes. Also, mosquitoes thrive in warm, wet places. As we know, the Earth is becoming warmer and warmer, and as it does, not only does the geographic distribution of these mosquitoes grow, but the mosquitoes are able to exist in these regions for longer. Because of this, some scientists expect Anopheles mosquitoes, which are the vector of malaria, to be present in wet areas of the United States from Miami to Seattle. Now, the presence of Anopheles mosquitoes alone doesn't pose a threat to us. But when they are present, all you need is one person who went somewhere where malaria is endemic to become infected and come back to the United States to be fed on by a female mosquito while, say, in Miami, for there to be a huge outbreak. I don't know about you, but when I first heard about this, I got really worried. I mean, growing up in New York, I never thought that when I saw a little bump from a mosquito on my arm that I'd be worried that I got something like Zika or malaria. Luckily, people have already started developing solutions to the problems that we might face because of this. To put our minds at ease, I reached out to Letitia Smith, and we chatted about methods of vector control. Here's our interview.
Hi, I'm Letitia Smith, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Entomology Department at Cornell University.
What vector-borne diseases would you say have the most impacts in the regions where they're endemic?
Well, globally, I think the most impactful vector-borne disease is obviously malaria. Altogether, vector-borne diseases account for quite a lot of infections in humans. This burden is mostly in tropicals and subtropical areas, more so than in the temperate or colder regions. And that's mostly because there are more insects and they live year-round, and so there's higher chances of them to be able to, populations grow of the vectors, and that can then infect humans. So malaria, I would consider it to be the most impactful one. It's worse, or the highest burden is actually in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's but it is also found in other continents. It's actually present in, I think, 87 countries. So it happens there's actually malaria in the Americas, there's malaria in Southeast Asia. It's spread across the world. It's just that the burden is highest in Africa.
What are the geographic distributions of these vectors? Do we already have some in the United States?
Oh, absolutely. So, for example, a lot of the malaria vectors, we actually have them here in the U.S. In fact, malaria used to occur in the U.S. A long time ago. But we managed to get rid of it mostly by using DDT and also by draining wetlands. And so DDT has also been used in a lot of other countries, but by the time we got to that, resistance was already becoming a main problem. And also the environmental impacts of DDT is something that became more of concern. And also draining wetlands is kind of a very expensive and difficult thing to do. So even though we were able to locally get rid of it in the places in the U.S. where that was a problem, because we've actually drained most of our wetlands, it's not something that you can do across an entire continent like Africa, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I feel like when I think of malaria, I always think of Africa. But I remember in a class learning about an outbreak of malaria in Ithaca. I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, but it's crazy to think about. Like, it was here once, so it could come back.
It could, absolutely. All because we have the vector. What we don't have are the infected people. So to get a disease to become an endemic problem like that, you need both things. And actually, if you can eliminate the disease from a population for long enough, it doesn't matter how many vectors you have. If that disease isn't cycling in the population anymore, then it's basically gone. So the vectors are still going to be a nuisance because they bite us and it's annoying, but they're no longer transmitting the disease if you can break that cycle. And that's what happened here. So the same thing can happen. So the other really big disease is dengue and also Zika and a lot of these viruses that are transmitted by Aedes aegypti. It's huge in the Americas and Southeast Asia, but it's also present around the world. And the vector is also spreading. So actually, because places are becoming warmer, it's actually the Aedes aegypti is starting to be able to live further and further north. So now we even find them occasionally in some southern parts of the U.S., and they're even finding them in like Italy or some parts of southern Europe too.
So let's say someone went to Kenya where there's a really high incidence of malaria, and they became infected and then flew home and was bitten by a mosquito here in the United States. Could that be enough to start an outbreak?
And with traveling the way it is, that's kind of not hard to happen.
Right. Let's say that happened and we had an outbreak. What technologies do we have to combat it?
Right. So the most common method right now is the same one that we've been using forever, which is insecticides. Depending on the vector, this is applied differently. So for malaria, one of the most common ways that insecticides are used are in insecticide-treated bed nets. So they basically just hang a fabric, kind of like a netting over the bed where people sleep, that it has some insecticide on it. So it kind of has two purposes. One, it prevents the mosquito from reaching the person because it's just a physical barrier, but it also kills the insect if it lands on the net, as long as it's not resistant to it.
Right.
The problem that you have with that is that it's not always used properly. Also, they're expensive because this is something that you have to give each person, so it does cost to produce and to distribute them. But the main problem is also just educating the people so that they know how to use it and when to use it. So those are kind of some of the challenges with that. In addition to it, it really only protects you if you're in bed. And so if you're outside during that dusk and dawn time period, you're still going to be just equally at the risk of getting an infection. So yeah, that's one way that insecticides are used, but they're also used as spraying, either indoor residual spraying. This is very common as well for malaria, but also for dengue and other vector control, where they just sprayed insecticides around the house. So in areas where the mosquitoes would normally go and rest after they had a blood meal, basically. But they're always going and resting against walls and things like that. And so they applied insecticide to those areas so that when the mosquito lands on it, it gets exposed to insecticide and dies. And then during bigger outbreaks, this is, I think, less common as far as I know for malaria, but certainly more common for dengue and Zika and those, that one vector specifically. And that is the space spraying. That's when they actually go around and just spray an area. like just the air, basically. They're spraying it around the town. And that's kind of like another very common method of control.
Yeah. So, what are the environmental impacts of spraying all these pesticides just everywhere?
Yeah, right. So yes. So for this kind of spraying of insecticides, I don't know what the details of the environmental impacts are. I'm not even sure how many studies are actually looking at non-target effects. But even urban environments have a lot of local insects and that are there, and that many of them are beneficial, or at least not a problem, or beneficial in some way or another. And they're certainly being targeted by that during those kind of spraying. Now, the indoor residual spraying probably has very little impact, because unless it's an indoor pest or some kind of an insect that happens to be inside your house, which most people would just kill it anyway. So those are the ones that would probably be targeted in that case.
What would be the ecological impacts of eliminating an entire species of mosquitoes?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and something that's been coming up more and more because of the new technologies that are showing up to control vectors. So you may have heard of the gene drives or gene editing and things like that.
So, quick side note about gene drive. Scientists successfully sequenced the genomes of several Anopheles mosquito species, including those responsible for the malaria transmission in Africa. And by doing this, they were able to identify the genes that underlie the mosquito's ability to colonize human habitats, their reproductive biology, and their susceptibility to infection by the malaria parasite. If we know the genes or variants of genes that are responsible for these key mosquito traits, we can theoretically introduce a genetic modification into the insects that would reduce pathogen transmission.
Gene drives or gene editing and things like that as kind of the new generation, let's say, of vector control. So most of these are, gene drive at least is not something that's being used yet. It's just in the laboratory that people are studying. But certainly sterile insect techniques and even using the symbiotic bacteria Wolbachia to control, either suppress the population or to control how well it's capable of transmitting diseases.
Wolbachia is a genus of bacteria that can live within the cells of anywhere between 20 and 70% of the world's insects. Normally, Wolbachia hangs out in a symbiotic balance within an insect's cells, and it acts as a neutral or even beneficial guest to its host. But it was discovered that Wolbachia can also have really negative impacts on host organisms, particularly on their ability to reproduce. In mosquitoes, males and females infected with Wolbachia have to have the same strain of the bacteria to successfully reproduce. If there's a mismatch, the bacteria will sabotage the male's sperm, effectively sterilizing him. Essentially, you can think of Wolbachia as sperm poison that's activated when the sperm reaches an egg infected with a different strain of the bacteria, causing the sperm to self-destruct. Okay, last side note, now back to Leticia.
So those are kind of new techniques that are being used, and some of them, especially the ones that suppress a population, and in particularly gene drives, because that is kind of the you're sterilizing the insects, but over all of their generation. This is a mutation that is spreading across the population. So you really ultimately have the consequence of eliminating that species potentially from that area, or potentially even globally at some point.
What would be the ecological impacts of eliminating an entire species of mosquitoes?
So all of this is still being studied. And this is where the question comes often that people ask this, what happens if you eliminate a species altogether from the planet? So what are the benefits of mosquitoes, let's say?
They do a lot of bad, but they also do some good.
They're there, right? There are animals that eat them. Certainly some amphibians and other insects, and so they do, I'm sure, have some kind of a purpose. I'm not sure that they're very good pollinators, although they do, especially the males, they do actually feed on plant nectar. So they do need sugar to survive, and because the males don't feed on blood. But I don't believe that they're necessarily very good pollinators. I don't know the answer to that if they are. But as far as the food chain, let's say if you were to remove all mosquitoes in the world, I definitely think there would be some ecological impact. But in these cases, these controls are usually very targeted. So you're eliminating a single species. And there are about a little over 3,000 species, I believe, of mosquitoes in the world. Just here in New York State, we have, I think, approximately 45 species of mosquitoes. So most likely eliminating a single one isn't going to crash the entire ecosystem.
Right.
Another thing to consider is that oftentimes these vectors are actually invasives themselves. For example, Aedes aegypti is not native to the Americas. It's actually native to Africa that spread around the world a long, long time ago. So it's been here for a long time, but it's not actually native. So there's so many other native mosquito species that probably play a much bigger ecological role than Aedes aegypti does. And the problem with things like Africa or with the malaria vector in Africa is that there are actually a lot of different mosquitoes that transmit malaria. So that actually adds a complication to this kind of new genetic editing techniques to control it, because in that case you might have to target several specific species of it. But yeah, it's a really good question that at this point for those particular new techniques, there is no answer, and it's something that is being researched and people are keeping that in mind. But there could be, although in my opinion it would be unlikely, particularly for vectors like Aedes aegypti that are not even usually native to where they're being controlled.
That's actually really interesting because Aedes aegypti spreads, to name a few, Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, and dengue. So eliminating this single species could potentially reduce the number of cases of mosquito-borne illnesses by a really significant amount, not to mention help to revert the invaded ecosystems to the state they were in before they were invaded by these Aedes aegypti. If we were to successfully eliminate this species, what proportion of the global mosquito population would we have left?
Yeah, I don't have an answer specifically to that. I'm not sure people have really looked into the abundance of all mosquito species. It's very local. I think that if you look at urban areas where this mosquito is endemic, they probably make up the vast majority of the mosquitoes you'll find. Like if you go to Rio in Brazil or the areas where this mosquito is a big problem in a big city, it's probably going to be the only mosquito you're going to find there, or one of the very, very few species that you'll find. Now, if you start leaving the city and going into more suburban and the farther away you get from the city, then you start getting different species. And probably if you're far away enough from the city, you might not even find Aedes aegypti anyway. Or very, very rare. They're not like forest mosquitoes. They're completely domesticated. They love us.
Oh, poor mosquitoes. They love a host that'll never love them back. That's it for this episode. Huge thanks to Letitia Smith for allowing me to interview her today. If you have any ideas for topics for future episodes that you want to hear, or you want to share your thoughts on this episode with me, you can find me on Twitter at MonicaCramer12. That's MonicaCramer12. Until next time, listeners.